The Sunset Strip in 1991 was a war zone disguised as a party. A neon-soaked stretch of asphalt where the most dangerous men in rock and roll drank shoulder to shoulder with hustlers, groupies, and broken dreamers who had come to Los Angeles chasing fame and found something far darker instead. On any given night, the Rainbow Bar and Grill sitting right there on the corner of Sunset Boulevard was a cathedral of chaos, a place where genuine legends parked themselves on torn leather barstools nursing whiskey while nobody even batted an eye. Because in that room everybody was either somebody or doing a damn good job pretending to be. It was inside this exact room, on a thick humid Thursday night in the late summer of '91, that two of the most volatile men in the entire history of heavy music found themselves sitting barely 15 feet apart without having planned it, without having spoken in weeks, and without the slightest clue that before the night was over they would be standing back to back with blood drying on their knuckles and a stranger laid out cold on the barroom floor. Lemmy Kilmister, the unkillable iron god of Motorhead, was planted in his usual corner like a piece of furniture that had always been there. A Jack Daniels and Coke sweating on the bar top in front of him, a Marlboro burning slow between his nicotine-stained fingers. Axl Rose, the red-haired fury of Guns N' Roses, had blown through the front door about an hour earlier wearing a black leather jacket and carrying a mood so dark that every single person in his entourage had already learned to keep their distance. Because Axl in the summer of 1990, one was a man standing on the razor edge of the biggest album launch in rock history, and the pressure was quietly turning him into a time bomb that nobody around him knew how to defuse. What happened next inside that bar has been whispered about for over 30 years, denied by managers, half confirmed by bartenders who were there, and systematically buried by every publicist who touched it. But right now the full story of the night Lemmy and Axl fought side by side against a man who had absolutely no idea he had just made the worst mistake of his life is finally going to be told. If you have not already, take a moment and subscribe to this channel because the stories we tell here are the ones the music industry never wanted you to hear. To understand what happened that night at the Rainbow, you first have to understand what the summer of 1991 was doing to both of these men. Lemmy Kilmister at 45 years old was deep into what people around him privately called the impossible years, a stretch of time when every doctor, every promoter, and every friend he still had left was quietly waiting for the phone call that would tell them the old man had finally gone down. He had been drinking a bottle of Jack Daniels every single day for close to 20 years at that point, smoking 2 packs of Marlboros between sunrise and last call, and consuming enough amphetamines to have killed 3 normal men twice over, and yet somehow the bastard just kept showing up. His body had become something that medical science genuinely could not explain, a walking chemical experiment that defied every rule in the toxicology textbook. And the running joke on the Sunset Strip that summer was that God himself was afraid to come collect Lemmy because even the Almighty did not want that kind of trouble. Motorhead had just wrapped a brutal European tour that spring and Lemmy had parked himself back at his tiny apartment on Larrabee Street, just a short stumble from the Rainbow, where he intended to do exactly what he always did between tour, which was drink, play the video poker machines, and wait for the world to either entertain him or leave him alone. Axl Rose, on the other hand, was not just looking for trouble that summer, he was manufacturing it on an industrial scale. The Use Your Illusion sessions had nearly destroyed Guns N' Roses from the inside out, with Axl demanding take after take in the studio, until the other band members were ready to walk out and never come back. Slash was numbing himself with heroin. Duff McKagan's pancreas had literally exploded from alcohol abuse just months earlier. Izzy Stradlin was quietly planning his exit from the band, disgusted by everything it had become. And in the middle of all this wreckage stood Axl Rose, the perfectionist tornado who believed he was building the greatest rock album ever recorded and that anyone who could not keep up deserved to be left behind. The twin albums would not drop until September, but by August the pressure had turned Axl into something genuinely unpredictable, a man who could go from laughing to screaming in the space of a single heartbeat, and his entourage had developed an unspoken system of hand signals and eye contact to warn each other when the boss was about to blow. That particular Thursday night, Axl had gotten into a vicious phone argument with someone at Geffen Records about the album artwork, and by the time he stormed into the Rainbow around 11:30, his mood was so poisonous that even the bartenders quietly moved the breakable glasses to the back shelf. Now here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn, because most people assume that Lemmy and Axl were close friends by 1991, but the truth is more complicated. They knew each other, certainly. They respected each other in the way that two predators sharing the same territory develop a cautious mutual awareness. Lemmy had been a fixture on the Sunset Strip since the mid-70s, long before Axl had hitchhiked into Lowe's Angels from Indiana with nothing but a bag of clothes and a voice that sounded like someone had set a choir boy on fire. But Axl was different, and Lemmy knew it from the first time he heard him sing, because underneath all the chaos and the tantrums, Axl Rose possessed a genuine fury that could not be faked, a rage from somewhere so deep that it powered everything he touched with an electricity most musicians spend their entire lives trying to find. Lemmy once told a journalist that Axl reminded him of a younger version of himself, except with better hair and worse judgment, and that quote had made its way back to Axl through the Strip grapevine and had pleased him more than any five-star review ever could. But by the summer of '91, their relationship had cooled, not because of any argument, but simply because Axl had disappeared into the recording sessions and Lemmy did not chase after people. So when Axl walked in that night and spotted Lemmy in his usual spot, there was a brief moment of eye contact, a slight nod from Lemmy, a barely visible lift of the chin from Axl, and then both men went back to their drinks. Neither one of them had any way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, a complete stranger was going to do something so monumentally stupid that it would bond them together for the rest of their lives. The man who walked into the Rainbow at approximately 1:15 in the morning did not belong there, and everyone who saw him knew it instantly. He was big, maybe 6'3", with the kind of thick-necked build that suggested either construction work or a serious gym habit, and he was wearing a button-down shirt tucked into pressed khakis, an outfit that on the Sunset Strip was the equivalent of walking into a biker rally in a business suit and asking where the salad bar was. He had two friends with him dressed in similar fashion, carrying the loud, overconfident energy of men who had come to Hollywood for the weekend to see how the other half lived and were determined to leave with a story worth telling. The bartender that night, a veteran named Mike who had been pouring drinks since the early '80s, would later recall that the moment he saw those three walk in, he got a feeling in his gut that told him the night was about to go sideways. He had developed that instinct over a decade of working a bar where rock stars, bikers, drug dealers, and tourists collided on a nightly basis, and that instinct was almost never wrong. They grabbed a table near the middle of the room and immediately began doing what tourists always did at the Rainbow, which was stare openly at everyone trying to figure out which faces they recognized. They ordered round after round, getting louder each time, their laughter cutting through the steady hum of the bar like a chainsaw through butter. Somewhere around 1:45, the big man broke the unwritten rule of the Rainbow in spectacular fashion. He got up to go to the bathroom, and on his way back, either by accident or by drunken provocation, he bumped hard into Lemmy's shoulder and sent the remains of a Jack Daniels and Coke splashing across the bar and onto the sleeve of Lemmy's denim vest. Lemmy did not react the way most people would have expected. He did not jump up or shout. He slowly lifted the Marlboro from between his lips, set it on the edge of the ashtray, and then turned his head just far enough to look at the man who had spilled his drink with those pale blue eyes that had been staring down trouble since before this stranger was probably born. There was a silence that lasted maybe 2 full seconds but felt like it stretched across an entire century, and everyone at the bar who was paying attention understood that something very bad was about to happen. Lemmy looked at the whiskey soaking into his sleeve, then back up at the man and said just 5 words in a voice quieter than anyone expected. The big man, drunk enough to be brave and sober enough to be mean, did not apologize. Instead he laughed, spread his arms wide in a gesture that was unmistakably mocking, and said something about not caring about some old man's drink, adding a word that questioned Lemmy's masculinity in the crudest possible terms. The regulars went dead silent. Mike the bartender reached under the counter where he kept a baseball bat, and 15 feet away, Axl Rose slowly set down his glass and turned his full attention toward the scene unfolding at Lemmy's end of the bar. What happened next unfolded so fast that witness accounts vary wildly, but what every single person agrees on is this. Lemmy stood up from his barstool with a speed that should not have been possible for a man who had been drinking for 6 straight hours, and before the stranger could finish his next sentence, Lemmy's forehead connected with the bridge of his nose in a headbutt so clean and brutal that the crack of cartilage was audible from across the room. The big man staggered backward, blood pouring from both nostrils, his eyes wide with the shock of discovering that the old man he thought was an easy target was a veteran of more bar fights than most people have had hot dinners. But the two friends were already on their feet, and now it was 3 against 1. That is exactly when Axl Rose appeared at Lemmy's shoulder like a ghost materializing from thin air. Nobody saw Axl cross the room. One second he was sitting alone and the next he was standing right next to Lemmy, shoulder to shoulder, his green eyes locked onto the two remaining men with an expression that anyone who had seen Axl in a rage would recognize as the look right before someone got seriously hurt. The two friends hesitated, but alcohol overrode their survival instincts, and the bigger of the two threw a wide looping right hand at Axl's head. He missed. Axl ducked under it with reflexes sharpened since his teenage years in Lafayette, Indiana, and then everything dissolved into chaos. The fight lasted less than 90 seconds, but in bar fight time that is an eternity, and by the time Mike came around with his bat and two bouncers appeared from the back, the damage was done. The original big man was on the floor holding his nose. One friend was draped over an upturned table. The third had ended up behind the jukebox, showing no interest in continuing. Lemmy stood in the middle of the wreckage with a fresh cut above his left eyebrow and a look of mild annoyance, as if the fight had been nothing more than an irritating interruption to his drinking schedule. Axel was breathing hard next to him, his leather jacket torn at the shoulder, a red mark forming on his jaw. They were standing back to back surrounded by broken glass and overturned chairs, and for a long moment neither said a word. Then Lemmy reached into his vest, pulled out his Marlboros, shook one loose and offered it to Axel. Axel took it. Lemmy lit it for him with a battered Zippo lighter that had been in his pocket since the Hawkwind days, then lit one for himself, and the two of them stood there smoking in the middle of the destruction while the bouncers hauled the strangers toward the exit and Mike started sweeping up broken glass behind the bar. It was Lemmy who finally spoke first, and what he said was so perfectly Lemmy that the bartender remembered it word for word decades later. He told Axel he had a decent left hand but needed to keep his thumb outside his fist or he was going to break it. Axel laughed for the first time all night. They sat down together and for the next 3 hours until the sun came up over Hollywood Boulevard, they talked about everything and nothing, about music and women and the specific type of loneliness that comes from being famous in a city that does not actually care about anyone. About the way the world looks at 3 in the morning when everyone else has gone home, and you are still sitting at a bar with a glass in your hand wondering if this is all there is or if somewhere out there something better is waiting for men like them. That night changed something fundamental between them. Before the fight they had been acquaintances who acknowledged each other with cautious nods. After the fight they became allies, the kind of bond men form when they have bled next to each other and discovered that the other person did not run. In the months that followed, Axel began showing up at the Rainbow more frequently, gravitating toward Lemmy's corner, and the staff noticed that on those nights Axel's famous temper seemed to operate at a lower temperature, as if the older man's presence had a calming effect no therapist or manager had ever achieved. When Guns N' Roses released the Use Your Illusion albums and the tour became one of the most chaotic in rock history, there was one person who could still reach Axel when everyone else had given up. Tour managers learned that when Axel locked himself in his hotel room and refused to come out, there was one phone number that sometimes worked. Not his therapist, Lemmy, because Lemmy did not beg or threaten or reason. He simply told the truth in that low gravel voice that sounded like a diesel engine idling in a graveyard, and somehow the truth from Lemmy hit differently than from anyone else. Maybe it was because Axel knew that Lemmy had absolutely nothing to gain from the relationship. Lemmy did not want money, did not want favors, did not want connections or industry clout. Lemmy just wanted to drink his whiskey and play his music and die on his own terms. And that kind of pure, uncomplicated authenticity was so rare in the music industry that, when Axel encountered it, something inside him recognized it as the one thing he could actually trust in a world built almost entirely on lies. The 3 men who picked that fight at the Rainbow Bar and Grill in the summer of 1991 never found out who they had tangled with, at least not that night. They were escorted out the back door by bouncers, poured into a taxi, and sent back to whatever hotel they had come from with bloody noses and bruised egos and a bar story that they would undoubtedly tell for years without ever knowing the punchline. But the bartenders knew. The regulars knew. And within 48 hours, every musician on the Sunset Strip knew, because that is how stories travel in a community as small and as gossipy as the 90s Los Angeles rock scene. The story became one of those legendary whispered tales that the Strip was famous for generating. A piece of folklore that got a little bigger and a little wilder every time it was retold, until the details blurred into myth and the only people who knew exactly what happened were the 2 men who had been standing back to back in the middle of it. Lemmy never talked about the fight publicly because he considered that kind of self-promotion beneath him. When a journalist once asked him if it was true that he and Axel had gotten into a brawl together, Lemmy just took a long drag on his Marlboro, blew the smoke toward the ceiling, and said he could not remember, which was Lemmy's standard answer for any question he did not feel like answering. Axel was slightly less guarded. In a rare interview years later, his eyes got a look that people close to him described as the nearest thing Axl Rose ever displayed to tenderness. He said that Lemmy taught him that being tough did not mean being loud, and that the most dangerous man in any room is always the quietest one. On December 28, 2015, Lemmy Kilmister died in his apartment on Larrabee Street, the same apartment he had lived in for years, the same apartment that sat just a short walk from the Rainbow Bar and Grill, where so much of his life had played out between whiskey glasses and cigarette smoke, and the low hum of a jukebox that always seemed to be playing something he liked. He was 70 years old. He had outlived every prediction every doctor had ever made about him. He had survived decades of speed, oceans of Jack Daniels, 2 packs a day, and a lifestyle that should have killed him before 40. And yet when the end finally came, it was aggressive prostate and brain cancer that brought him down, diagnosed just 2 days before Christmas. 4 days after his 70th birthday, the man who could not be killed was gone. Axl Rose was one of the first to issue a public statement, and his words carried a weight that broke through the usual celebrity condolence formula. He called Lemmy a friend, a word Axl did not use lightly. He said the world was emptier and quieter without him, which from the loudest man in rock was perhaps the most meaningful tribute possible. But what Axl said privately to the small group who gathered at the Rainbow to drink in Lemmy's memory was something else entirely. Those who were there say Axl sat in Lemmy's spot, ordered a Jack Daniels and Coke, and raised it in a toast that contained words nobody present has ever been willing to repeat on the record. Whatever he said made 2 grown men cry and 1 bartender walk into the back room and not come out for 20 minutes. The glass that Axl drank from that night sat unwashed behind the bar for weeks afterward, and some of the old regulars swear it is still sitting there somewhere, tucked away on a shelf where nobody touches it. The Rainbow Bar and Grill still stands on the Sunset Strip, though the strip has changed beyond recognition from 1991. Tourists still come hopping to sit where Lemmy sat. But the people who were there on that Thursday night, who saw Lemmy headbutt a man twice his size and watched Axl Rose materialize from the shadows like a guardian angel made of leather and fury, those people know something no tourist will ever understand. The real magic of the Sunset Strip was never about the music or the fame. It was about whether the person next to you was going to run or stay when the glass started breaking. Lemmy stayed. He always stayed. And on one hot summer night in '91, Axl Rose learned what that kind of loyalty looked like, and he carried it with him for the rest of his life.